This episode is sponsored by Magisterium AI, the world's #1 AI-powered guide to church teaching. Query our knowledge base of over 9,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts and discover how AI is supercharging access to church teaching.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we look back at the last 7 days on the Vatican beat, which in the Pope Francis era are forever a tumultuous and telling period of time. We try to figure out what they have to teach us about this titillating period in a tremendously important period of the Church. I hope you'll agree that is a terrific use of words that start with the letter T. So we begin this week with shock talk. The Pope Francis channels his inner Howard Stern using a series of phrases perceived as off-color, in some cases vulgar, in other cases belittling, directed in these instances primarily at gays and women. We will unpack what the Pope said, why it has elicited controversy. We will also consider the intriguing possibility that perhaps none of this actually was an accident. Second up, we've got nay to NATO. The Vatican's top diplomat throws cold water on recent authorizations issued by several NATO powers for the use of weapons by Ukraine to strike at targets on Russian territory. We will explain what Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin had to say, what its consequences for the Vatican's geopolitical role going forward might be. Third up this week, we've got a zinger for Zuppi. The Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, essentially throws down in public, responding to Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Bologna, president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, over a proposed constitutional reform here in Italy. We'll talk about what the dispute is, but more importantly, what it might portend in terms of Zuppi's, well, the place he occupies on the Catholic landscape going forward. And then finally this week, we have a fond farewell bundled with a modest proposal. We bid goodbye to U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Joseph Donnelly. I'm going to give you my thoughts on how we ought to go about the business picking U.S. ambassadors to the Vatican. I guarantee you, no one is going to listen to what I have to say, but that is not going to stop me from saying it. All that and more is waiting for you on this episode of Last Week in the Church, so please stay where you are, because I will be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, June 4th, 2024. Hope you had a lovely weekend here in Italy. It was a big weekend, not only Catholic-wise, of course, did we have the Feast of Corpus Christi, but in Italy, Sunday was the secular holiday, the Festa della Repubblica, the holiday of the Republic, commemorating the anniversary of a historic election in 1946 in which Italians chose to become a republic rather than a monarchy in the wake of World War II. Wherever you were this weekend, I hope it was a blessed and joyful time, full of relaxation and recharging. Just before we get started this week, one quick programming note. Speaking of relaxation and recharging, my wife Elise and I are going to be on vacation the next couple of weeks. That means there will be no episode of Last Week in the Church either Tuesday, June 11th or Tuesday, June 18th. We will be back here Tuesday, June 25th. So it will be the last 3 weeks in the church at that point. And, obviously I don't have a crystal ball, but this is the Pope Francis era. I guarantee you, if we allow 3 weeks to go by, we're going to have some stuff to talk about. Speaking of stuff to talk about, let's start sifting through the last week on the Vatican beat. We begin this week with shock talk. The dominant Vatican headlines over the last week or so have been a series of comments that Pope Francis made in what he believed, at least according to official statements, believed to be confidential closed-door sessions, which nevertheless leaked out and which have caused controversy, consternation, contretemps because of their allegedly, sort of off-color, salty-tongued, vulgar, or belittling character. So we begin with a May 20th session with the Italian bishops, the Italian Bishops' Conference, known here by its acronym of CHE, which stands for the Episcopal Conference of Italy, held its plenary assembly in the Vatican Synod Hall. Pope Francis, as he always does, dropped by for a session, kind of a Q&A session with the bishops. This is always styled as a private thing so that, the Vatican does not release a transcript. There's no audio or video recording of it or anything like that. And apparently during that session, the question, the admission of gay candidates to Catholic seminaries came up, and Pope Francis was reported to have used a term which essentially to suggest that there's already too much of a gay culture in Catholic seminaries. The term he used in Italian was frociaggine, which translates roughly as faggotry. So the idea is there's too much faggotry in Catholic seminaries. Frociaggine has at its root the Italian word frocio, which literally means soft, but it's kind of a widely used pejorative term for gays. Okay? So that word, that term leaked out, caused a sort of global uproar. Now, that was still playing out when another Italian news site reported that in addition to frociaggine, the Pope had used another term in the same context, talking about gays in the seminary. The term was cheche, which is Italian slang for a stereotypically effeminate gay man. And it was the same idea to suggest there's already too much of that in seminary life, so that, the suggestion being we need to be careful about broadening permission, broadening authorizations for the admission of same-sex candidates to the seminary. So all of that having to do with his May 20th session from Italian bishops was playing out. Then, just a few days later, the Pope had a meeting with around 100 recently ordained priests in the Diocese of Rome. These are priests ordained within the last 10 years. By the way, the fact that there are 100 priests ordained within the last decade in Rome illustrates one of the infallible rules of Catholic life, which is there may be a priest shortage in other parts of the Catholic world. There sure as hell is not a priest shortage here in Rome. Okay, there are plenty of it. But in any event, in this closed-door session with priests, apparently the issue of gossip in the church came up. This is one of the Pope's favorite themes, of course, the dangers of gossip. He used an Italian slang term, chiacchiericcio, which basically translates as petty little chatter, and suggested that that is a woman's thing, roba delle donne. It's the stuff women do. He went on to say that as men, we wear the pants and therefore we have to talk. None of this, of course, played particularly well in quarters, what you might describe as more PC quarters, where these sort of stereotypical, machismo references to women just simply do not go down particularly well. No suggestion of vulgarity in this case, simply, belittling stereotypical kind of language. Now, every time one of these revelations occurred, what we saw was a kind of dynamic, both on social media and also in mainstream press outlets, of an attempt to kind of explain it away. People would give versions of one of three, or some combination of these three theories. One, look, the Pope is 87. There's a generational dynamic here. He is occasionally slipping into stereotypical language from his childhood, but he doesn't really mean it. It's not his developed thinking on these issues. These are simply cases of foot-in-mouth disease. And, the Vatican did put out an apology for that first anti-gay slur. It has not commented on the other revelations. But in any event, the theory here is the Pope simply misspoke, right? He fell back on kind of colloquial expressions from earlier in his life that he doesn't really intend. All right, second theory, he's not a native Italian speaker. He is using colloquial Italian terms. He doesn't really understand the weight or the connotations they have in Italian, so you have to give him a free pass. And the third theory is that these are expressions that are being completely ripped out of context by enemies of the Pope who were firing them out of a media canon in an effort to discredit, weaken, and sandbag him. Okay? So that's kind of the political interpretation. Now, I would suggest, while each of these theories about what's going on might have merit, We should also remember that Pope Francis is a deeply savvy figure. He's nobody's fool. He's not a naive. By the way, his spoken and colloquial Italian is absolutely terrific. The suggestion that he doesn't know what he's saying, frankly, I struggle to accept. And so I think we need to at least consider the possibility that he knows what he's doing. Now, if he knows what he's doing, in other words, if he knew the response that these expressions were likely to provoke, why would he have uttered them? What interest would it have served? Well, aside from the fact that this is a pope who simply likes to keep people guessing, I would point out we have the concluding act of his Synod of Bishops coming up. We have the Jubilee year next year. Ultimately, of course, we have the selection of whoever's going to follow Pope Francis. And in each of these arenas, the Pope may well be concerned that there is already too much ideological tumult. Maybe he wants to lower the temperature a little bit among his conservative critics by reassuring them that he's not going to throw out the doctrinal baby with the pastoral bathwater. Perhaps he believes that by provoking the anger of the liberal elite, he will actually send a reassuring message to the other side of the street that might be more inclined to give him a break in these high-profile moments going forward. Is that actually what Pope Francis thinks? I don't know, but I think it's at least as plausible as the other theories we have heard. It will be interesting going forward to see whether the Pope as shock jock makes any other appearances. All right, second up this week, we have nay to NATO. So this past week, Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, meaning the Pope's top diplomat, was in Milan for the presentation of a book on the founder of the Vatican Bank. But whenever the Secretary of State makes a public appearance, what happens is that either before or after what he's actually there to do, there will be a scrum of journalists that forms around him with microphones and cell phones, TV cameras, thrust in his face. And he will be compelled to give 5 or 10 minutes of sort of ad hoc commentary on whatever the issue of the day happens to be. So at this event in Milan, Parolin was asked by reporters about decisions by several NATO powers, including the UK, France, Germany, and the United States, as well as Poland, Finland, and other nations, to authorize Ukraine to use weapons that those countries have transferred to Ukraine to strike Russian targets not only within the borders of Ukraine, but also within Russia itself, which heretofore had been considered unacceptable because it was considered that it might risk, an expansion of the war. It might trigger an undesired response from Russia, such as the use of tactical nuclear weapons in some kind of battlefield context. However, what has changed is that Russia has unleashed a massive invasion of the Kharkiv region of Ukraine. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city, and it's only 30 kilometers across the Russian border. So Russia was massing all of its forces just on the other side of the border, knowing that Ukraine couldn't attack them there. And so the Western powers have sort of given them the green light to take the fight to Russia. Now, Russia, of course, itself has reacted very negatively to this. But while in Milan, Parolin sort of joined the critical chorus. He said this decision by NATO countries ought to worry anybody who has the well-being of the planet at stake. He called it a deeply troubling prospect, and he said that it may lead to an escalation of the conflict that no one can control. In other words, it seemed a pretty clear nay, or if you're so inclined, niet, to the NATO plan or the NATO authorization for Ukraine to take the fight to Russia. Now, does this change the Vatican's geopolitical profile in any way? No. The Vatican, under Pope Francis, from the beginning, has been a steady critic of the escalation of the war in Ukraine. It has been a critic of the Western policy of funneling arms into this conflict. It, from the beginning, has called for a negotiated settlement. But it is yet another reminder, I suppose, that in the Pope Francis era, the Vatican simply is not the reliable ally of the Western powers that it once was. That, in fact, it has a foreign policy position much more analogous to the BRICS nations, that is Brazil, India, South Africa, and others, than it does to, say, Washington or London or Brussels. It's also another instance in which Ukrainians, including, by the way, the 6 million strong Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, probably are going to be somewhat unhappy with the line the Vatican is taking. I should add that in the same context, Parolin said that the Vatican continues to be engaged on the humanitarian front in the Ukraine conflict, particularly the project to try to return some of those kidnapped Ukrainian children to their families. Parolin said that for the moment, its diplomatic activity is restricted to the humanitarian realm because there simply isn't the space, meaning the openness on either side for the Vatican to do anything else. Obviously, we will continue to track this story. All right, third up this week, a zinger for Zuppi. So, here in Italy, one of the big-ticket political talking points at the moment is a project that is being sponsored by the country's conservative government to amend the Italian constitution to allow for the direct election of the prime minister. Because at the moment, the way it works in Italy is that people don't vote for the prime minister, they vote for parties. And then depending on which parties get the most seats in parliament, they get together and then they choose the prime minister. Many critics believe that that system has produced a kind of chronic instability in Italian politics. It is a fact that for the 77 years since Italy became a democratic republic, it has had 70 different governments. Do the math. That is a new government every 13 months. So, I mean, in other words, Italian governments are not distinguished for their longevity. The current government believes that direct election of a prime minister for a full 5-year term would solve that problem. Critics, particularly among the country's progressive political forces, think this is an ad hoc move by the current government simply intended to strengthen its own power. They think it will diminish the role of the Italian president, it will diminish the role of the Italian parliament, that it's anti-democratic in addition to just being vague and ill-conceived. So, big debate. Recently, during that plenary assembly of the Italian bishops we mentioned earlier, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Bologna, the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, was asked about this question of the reform of the prime minister's office. And basically what he said is, yeah, some bishops discussed that during our meeting. Some are worried about it. He said that touching the institutional equilibriums of the government is a very delicate thing. It should only be done with great caution. He said it should be done in the spirit of the Italian Constitution, which was written by different political forces, but all of whom had the common good in mind. And so therefore, he said, whatever happens, it should not be partisan, but it should be, a shared project. Now, because the debate right now is quite partisan, the perception of most Italian commentators was that Zuppi was coming out against the government. In other words, he was coming out against this proposed reform, the prime minister's office, known here as the premieriato, that is the creating of a premiership, through direct election. Now, in response, conservative Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni went on Italian television not long after Zuppi made these comments, and she was asked about what Cardinal Zuppi had to say. And what she said basically was, first of all, that, it's interesting. But she said, with all due respect, I would like to remind the Cardinal that the Vatican is not a parliamentary republic. So why it should be taking positions on how parliamentary republics work, I'm paraphrasing here, but her point was it's a bit of a mystery. And she said, let's just make sure going forward that they don't have these concerns. I mean, in other words, she was essentially telling Zuppi to buzz off. Said, you don't run a democracy, so don't tell other democracies how to handle their business, okay? Now, this is striking in any context, because when you have the elected leader of a country and the leader of that country's bishops' conference squaring off in public over a key matter of political and constitutional interest, obviously that's a big deal. But what adds interest here is that Cardinal Matteo Zuppi is, of course, not merely the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, but on most people's handicapping lists right now, he would be considered an odds-on favorite to be the next pope. I mean, he would have odds of like 3-1, 4-1, 5-1. In other words, he would be considered an A-list candidate. And so the question is, does this do anything to his stock? And the interesting answer is, it might. Because the perception is that Pope Francis and Meloni actually enjoy a fairly warm relationship. Last year, you may remember, there was a big pro-family event here in Rome where Meloni and Pope Francis shared a stage. They took pretty much exactly the same positions. The Pope endorsed Meloni's policies to try to boost Italy's fertility rate. They were sharing laughs and hugging one another. Recently, Pope Francis allowed Meloni to be the one to announce publicly that the Pope, for the first time, will attend a G7 meeting, which he is going to do in a couple of weeks here in Rome when the G7 meets in the southern Italian region of Puglia. Normally, the Vatican would announce that, but instead, the Pope allowed Meloni to do it in a video message. Most recently, when the Pope celebrated his first ever World Day of Children, there was Giorgia Meloni in the front row. The two shared a laugh, a tear, and a hug during the course of the liturgy. So this is really the first time that some people are perceiving some daylight between Pope Francis and Zuppi. In general, up to this point, the perception has been that everything Zuppi says and does comes with a good housekeeping seal of approval from Pope Francis. However, some Italian commentators are now saying that Zuppi is actually going farther than Francis in terms of kind of creating an adversarial relationship with the current Italian government, which has raised the question, will Zuppi be the next senior prelate to fall out of Pope Francis's favor? It's not like we haven't seen this show before. Cardinal Angelo De Donatis, the vicar of Rome, Cardinal Peter Turkson, one-time head of the Pope's Dicastery for Human Development, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, former head of the Dicastery for Evangelization, and others, people who were once perceived as having the Pope's ear and basking in his favor, who for one reason or another are now perceived as on his B list. Some are raising the question of whether that could be Zuppi's fate as well. I think it's too early to draw that conclusion right now, but, let's follow it. It's going to be interesting. All right, finally this week, a fond farewell to U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Joseph Donnelly, former senator from Indiana, who was nominated by President Biden in 2021 and has represented the United States to the Holy See since 2022. It was announced this past week that Donnelly has elected to step down as ambassador and will be returning to the United States to spend time with his family and so on. Let me just say that Ambassador Donnelly, since he got here, has carved out a reputation as an incredibly affable and genial figure, just a guy who it is metaphysically impossible to dislike, a genuinely kind person, and he will be missed. If nothing else, I will say this, he will go down in history as the ambassador to the Holy See, who once upon a time presided over a July 4th party that included Nancy Pelosi, Newt and Callista Gingrich, and Cindy McCain. Now, if that is not a festival of American omnipartisanship, it's not even bipartisan, right? It's omnipartisanship. And that is, all the colors of the rainbow. I don't think we've ever seen it. Now, although no one has said this out loud, the great likelihood is that the Biden administration is not going to try to name a new ambassador right away. They will almost certainly wait for the elections in November, because obviously, if they were to nominate someone now, they probably wouldn't even be confirmed for the elections to begin with. But even if they were, Biden were to lose in November, they would have the shortest term as ambassador to the Vatican in all of history. So, everything in terms of who comes next will depend on what happens in November. In the meantime, I would like to float two brief, modest proposals when it comes to the business of choosing an American ambassador to the Holy See. These are things I have suggested for the last 25 years. Absolutely no one has listened to me up to this point. I have no reason to expect anyone is going to listen to me now, but that's not going to stop me from repeating it. Two proposals. One, I believe we need to break the practice that the ambassador to the Vatican has to be a political appointee instead of a career foreign service professional. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say, when I go to a foreign country for the first time, one of my practices is I always make an appointment with the political officer at the U.S. Embassy there to kind of get the lay of the land. I have infallibly found these to be incredibly smart, competent, talented, well-informed, extremely balanced, extremely reliable individuals. We may complain about wasteful spending in other areas of the government, but I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to the American Foreign Service, we get our nickel's worth. These are incredibly talented people. I have known every Deputy Charge of Mission, or DCM, that is the number 2 official at the Vatican Embassy for the last 25 years. Every one of them would have made a spectacular ambassador to the Vatican. And so I would suggest, let's forget that it always has to be an ex-senator, an ex-head of the RNC or the DNC, or some politically wired figure who actually doesn't have any experience of either diplomacy or the Vatican, often. And instead, let's open to the possibility that there are career diplomats in the fold who might actually make a terrific ambassadorial choice. In other words, let's stop artificially limiting the talent pool. Secondly, we have to break the idea that this person has to be Catholic. Number one, because again, it limits the talent pool. Number two, because it injects a false and misleading and distracting element of inter-ecclesiastical politics. With Democrats, we ask, are they pro-life enough? With the Republicans, we ask, are they pro-social justice enough? Thing of it is, these people are not being picked to represent the catechism of the Catholic Church. They're being picked to represent an American administration to the Vatican. So, examining their Catholic bona fides has nothing to do with anything, and yet we can't help doing it when it is a Catholic appointee. So, those are my two proposals. One, open it up to career diplomats, not just politicos. And number two, don't get hung up on the idea it has to be a Catholic. That is going to make for a broader and better selection of potential candidates. Will anyone actually do this? I have my doubts. I've been saying it for a long time. It hasn't happened yet. That doesn't make it wrong. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is our show for this week. As ever, you can find full coverage of all of these stories on the Crux site, cruxnow.com. As I mentioned, we will be off for the next 2 weeks, but we will be back here in this same bat time, same bat channel on Tuesday, June 25th. In the meantime, have a fantastic and blessed fortnight. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk to you again refreshed and recharged very, very soon.